The essence is, of course, a kind of form, a kind of ideal form that pre-exists its incarnation in actual forms. And matter is an inert receptacle for those forms that come from the outside. The forms act as a kind of a mold, whether they are Platonic essences or ideas in the mind of God, and then are imposed on this inert matter by a command. Let there be light. We saw the very first slide that Lars showed, the command in action. As if matter couldn't radiate electromagnetic energy on its own, as if matter was this just inert receptacle for forms that had to come from an outside, a psychic agency, a reservoir of eternal archetypes. The opposite paradigm from that would be to endow matter with morphogenetic capacities of its own and say that there are forms because there are processes. There are historical processes, tectonic processes that construct those forms. Some of them are geological, some of them are biological, some of them are cosmological, some of them are meteorological. But all of those processes are creating those forms in a historical way, as long, of course, as we give the meaning of, as we don't read the word history as referring only to human history, as one typically does if one is anthropocentric, but be able to use it for evolutionary history, for geological history, for meteorological history, for cosmological history. That would be the morphogenetic way of looking at things. So what kinds of concepts do we need to think morphogenetically? Well, first of all, we need to ascribe to those entities that are mind-independent certain properties of their own. Properties such as, some of the properties can be extensive properties such as length, volume, amount of components. Some of the properties are what thermodynamicists call intensive: temperature, pressure, speed, density. Properties at any one point can be listed. The properties of something can be listed. They are always given. They're always actual. However, the main source of variability in material form does not come from properties, but from capacities. And that's the second concept that we need to introduce to distinguish the two. Imagine a knife having the property of being sharp. The property of being sharp is something that a knife either has or doesn't have. And it's something that it is very easy to explain. One takes the cross-section of the edge of the knife, and being sharp simply means having a certain triangular, pointy form for that cross-section. The knife is either sharp, has that pointy form, or is not sharp. And at any one point, it is either sharp or not sharp. A capacity is something else. It's the capacity of the knife to cut things. That capacity may never be exercised and therefore may never be actualized. A knife may stay in the kitchen cabinet forever because one never had an opportunity to actually cut something with it. It has the capacity to cut, but it was never exercised. Another difference, in other words, a capacity is not like a property that's an actual property. A capacity may just exist virtually, may just exist there potentially, and never actually be exercised. A capacity is only actual in the process of being exercised when a knife is actually cutting something. A capacity is also different from properties in that capacities are always relational. The capacity to cut can only be exercised in interaction with another material body, which in turn has the capacity of being cut. Flesh is one of those materials, it's easily cut, but knives, even Ginzu knives, find certain objects that they cannot cut. They are not cuttable by knives, and therefore that capacity cannot be exercised. In other words, a capacity is always a capacity to affect that is coupled and must be coupled with a capacity of being affected. Given that the number of things that something may combine with and may interact with are potentially open-ended, unlike properties which are finite in number and always given, always actual, capacities are potential and potentially open-ended. Not always. In the case of a knife, it's very hard to imagine too many uses for a knife other than using it to cut things. One can pierce, one can cut in different ways, but it's always, establishing a rupture. But many other objects have capacities that are only discoverable by experiment. One needs to actually put them in conjunction with something else, related to something else, to discover what something can do. Take, for instance, water. The molecule of water has certain properties. For instance, it has a certain number of components. One oxygen molecule, two hydrogen molecules. Atoms. It has certain properties too, such as the angle that the bonds of these atoms make with respect to one another. It has certain electrical charges, which are also given. But water also has a variety of capacities that may or may not be exercised at any one point. For instance, water is thanks to its electrical properties, it's a solvent. In fact, it's a universal solvent, which basically means that it can interfere, it can intervene causally in reality to prevent other molecules from forming permanent bonds. It interferes with that and therefore dissolves things. That is one of the many capacities of water. One can never be sure that one knows all the capacities that something can have, because the capacities are an open-ended field of variability, given all the different entities that water may interact with. Water, for instance, may form all kinds of different molecules, such as carbohydrates and so on, depending on its combinatorial capacities. Water within the cell, within a living cell, may also interact in funny ways with proteins, which are also electrically charged in funny ways, and become layered, and then be part of processes within the cell, which are completely unknown outside the cell. So it depends on now its interactions with organic molecules. One can never be sure that one has exhausted the capacities of something. And the more complex the object, the more properties differ from capacities. Think of the human body. The human body has certain properties, such as height, weight, and so on. But it also has millions of capacities. And those capacities are different depending on the social context in which you find the human body. Certain social contexts, particularly marginal spaces, such as circuses, bring out capacities of the human body that nobody thought were there, and that certainly cannot be explained evolutionarily. Think of the juggler. That's an assemblage made out of a human body, a couple of balls, and perhaps a flying banana. No one would have thought that the human body had the capacity to be a juggler, or even worse, the capacity to be a tightrope walker. Who would have thought that you can put somebody with a bar and suspend in mid-air, and the human body would have that capacity? Or the trapeze, jumping and flying around in the air capacity. And I'm just right now limiting myself to a circus, which is a very marginal social space. All crafts, metallurgy, carpentry, ceramics, force the body to display capacities in interaction with materials. So capacities are the main source of variability of matter and of material entities such as the human body. But properties themselves also vary. Everybody is aware of the fact that your temperature, even though it's supposed to be 98.6, is in fact fluctuating around a mean, that it is constantly varying quantitatively. But after certain thresholds, critical thresholds of intensity are reached, properties themselves may change. We're all familiar with the fact that water at 0 degrees centigrade goes from liquid to solid, and at 100 degrees centigrade goes from liquid to vapor, to steam. At that point, its very properties change. Steam expands, for instance. That is, it now occupies more space. You can use that capacity to now draw the pistons within a steam engine. So properties, despite the fact that they are given and that they can be listed in a finite list, are also subject to what we might now call tendencies. The tendency of material entities at certain critical points of intensity, at certain critical points of temperature, certain critical points of pressure, and so on, change from one set of properties to another set of properties. The amount of variability here is more limited than in the case of capacities, given that most materials have only the solid, the liquid, and the gas state. Nevertheless, even properties display a repertoire, more limited repertoire, but a repertoire of variabilities. Therefore, variability is everywhere. It's in properties, it's in capacities. And it is, of course, humans who, through experiments, whether artistic experiments, whether craft experiments, whether scientific experiments, begin to discover whether the space of capacities, the space of variation is more limited for certain substances, for certain material entities, for certain material structures, or vaster, such as I was saying, the almost infinite space of possible capacities that the human body has.